Welcome to episode 19 of the CompTIA PenTest Plus training series, and in this episode we're going to be talking about cloud attacks, and this is all a continuation of the attacks and exploits module. So in the very first subsection, which was 4.1, we talked about pen testing and preparing attacks. And then we talked about the concept of network attacks in section 4.2. Section 4.3, we talked about authentication attacks. 4.4, we talked about host-based attacks. And in 4.5, we talked about web application attacks. And so in today's episode, in section 4.6, we're going to be talking about cloud attacks, which are attacks that are done against cloud services or the organizations that use cloud services for their virtual machines and their servers and their overall network infrastructure. So a cloud attack targets the misconfigurations or weak identity access management, also known as IAM, or exposed metadata services in secure containers. So these are the various elements, the various components of cloud infrastructure. So when we attack a cloud-based company, we would be attacking any of these potential vulnerabilities that exist. Now, since these environments, these cloud environments, host critical applications and data, we want to exploit misconfigured policies or exposed API endpoints, and of course privileged escalation paths to gain unauthorized access to the variety of different endpoints or components of that particular network. And that's basically everything that we're going to be talking about in this episode today. And as an overview, we're going to be talking about the metadata service attacks, IAM misconfigurations and exploitation, container escapes, and Kubernetes exploitation. And then, of course, just like everything else, we're going to be talking about the tools that we would be using for these types of attacks. For example, PackQ, KubeHunter or KubeHunter, Scout Suite, cloud native security tools, and whatever else that I'll probably go off on a tangent for and share with you as extra information. But that's essentially the overview of today's video. I think it's going to be a little bit straightforward than the previous videos because the previous videos have so many different rabbit holes that we can go into. This one is a little bit more contained. We're going to be talking about cloud infrastructure specifically and the variety of vulnerabilities and exploits that would be available to attack those types of infrastructures. That being said, let's go a quick review for how you can get this notes document as well as the practice question slideshow that's available through Hackaholics Anonymous, and then we'll dive deep into the content. To get the PenTest Plus notes, practice questions, and to join a supportive community of like-minded people like you, consider joining the Hackaholics Anonymous membership community. We have 4 tiers: the supporter, the agent, the guardian, and the master. And each tier gets their own Discord server and early access to content. The agent, guardian, and master levels will get exclusive content like line-by-line code explanations for how to create cybersecurity and PenTest Plus scripts, like exclusive downloads that they will get. For example, the notes document for this PenTest Plus and everything that I'm using for the lectures, as well as all of the practice questions and everything else that will go along that will be made for the scripts and everything else that we're going to be doing for the PenTest Plus training series. There will be free pre-made monthly Python automations that have to do with system administration, cybersecurity defense, as well as, of course, PenTest Plus and ethical hacking. And then there's going to be monthly live streams with me every single month, plus so many other things that you would get as a part of being a member of Hackaholics Anonymous in these tiers. To join, you can simply click the link in the description below, or you can go to our homepage and click the join button there, or you can go to youtube.com/@hankhackshackers/join, and you'll be able to join Hackaholics Anonymous. Now, without further ado, let us continue with PenTest Plus. Okay, first let's start with the metadata service attack. So what is the cloud metadata service? Now, a cloud provider, so these are companies like Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, etc. They have a metadata service that stores sensitive information, for example, the IAM credentials of their various users for a given company, or instance details, and an instance refers to virtual machines that are being launched or various tools or endpoints that are being launched. And those individual virtual machine instances, right, those types of, I guess we can call them tools or machines themselves or whatever they are, those things that are being launched, they're referred to as an instance. Now, the details of that instance is, for example, the IP address that is assigned to it, or the user credentials that would be assigned to it, or the login portal URL, etc., etc. So there are a lot of different things that fall under the instance details, and of course networking configurations. So really, when you want to think about this, is anything that would count as metadata. So if you know what metadata is, this should be relatively easy to wrap your head around. And the metadata of a file, for example, would be the author of the file. So who created that file on the computer? What date was it created? What type of file is it? Where is the path of the software that opens that file, etc., etc. So it's all of the details about the file itself, not considering the contents of the file. So the stuff that's inside the file would be considered content. The things around the file's creation and its software and the details of the date and the author and all of that stuff, that all falls under the metadata. So the same thing applies to cloud metadata. So it's the stuff that resides inside of that cloud provider and the metadata of whatever that specific asset is. So it could be somebody's credentials that belongs to their network and the virtual machine that was launched and what the credentials for that would be and what the identity as well as the access controls are for that credential. It could be the instance of, was it a Kali Linux machine that was launched? Was it a Microsoft Windows machine that was launched? What was it that was launched? Was it some kind of a server? Is it an individualized machine that belongs to a specific person? When was it launched? What's the IP address that's assigned to this? What subnet does it belong to? So on and so forth. Those are all the details of the instance. And of course, the configurations of their network, assuming that they actually have their network available through a cloud service provider. And the network itself could be, are they using routers through Amazon? Are they using a giant set of servers that are available at multiple warehouses? What is their configuration for their network infrastructure? So on and so forth. So there's a lot of details around it, but it all just falls under cloud metadata, right? So it's the details of the various services that a company may be using through AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, so on. So these metadata details are available via these specific IP addresses, which is actually very interesting when you really think about it, because AWS and Azure actually share the same IP address for storing their metadata. Now, this IP address or this specific path, this location, belongs to Amazon, so it's the IP and then latest metadata. For Azure, it's the IP and then metadata instance and then API version, for example, 2021-0101. That is one of the locations for Azure. And a Google Cloud has metadata.google.internal/compute metadata v1. So these are the locations where the metadata for that Google or for that cloud service provider is being stored. So if you want to access that metadata, it's accessible via any of these locations for these specific cloud service providers, these CSPs. Now, if you're using a different CSP, it has a different path that you can access it. So the objective of us attacking these types of services or this type of data is to steal IAM credentials from the cloud instances and to pivot within the cloud environment to access sensitive resources. Now, pivoting is also known as lateral movement, or it could be vertical movement where you actually escalate your privileges. But when you pivot, you're going from one endpoint to another, to another, to another, until you actually get to the one that you're most interested in, or it has the information that's most valuable to you. But the objective here is from any of these locations, you would try to steal IAM credentials. Now, AWS is going to have this specific thing be secure, but when you launch your instance, your virtual machine from AWS, that metadata is stored here. Now, you can choose to publicize your metadata, or you can choose to keep your metadata private, which is the recommended route if you want to be more secure, or have it limited to a handful of users that can access it. But some people have misconfigurations. Some companies don't configure their metadata locations securely, therefore it's available to the public, therefore you can steal IAM credentials from those cloud instances, assuming that it hasn't been configured properly and it's available to the public, right? So these are the core locations, but these specific locations are pretty much general, available to every single person that uses AWS or Azure or Google Cloud. It's just that when those people launch their instances, did they privatize their instances? Did they privatize their metadata? Did they block the access controls to everybody except the administrator of their domain, etc.? So that's where the security or the lack of security comes into play, right? If the individual companies that are setting these up through these CSPs, if those companies didn't properly set up their security controls, then as hackers, we can potentially access them. Now that we understand what metadata is, we need to talk about how to exploit these metadata services. So the first method would be server-side request forgery, and we actually talked about that in the previous episode for last week, which was all about web application attacks, web application exploits. So server-side request forgery can potentially lead to you being able to exfiltrate or export credentials, right? So if there's a vulnerable web application that allows the fetching of external URLs, which is what server-side request forgery essentially is as an attack. So if the web application allows the fetching of external URLs, the attacker can request the metadata service and extract those IAM credentials. Now here are a couple of specific tactics. So we can do a curl command. Now curl is available through the command line, and it's pretty much pre-installed with almost every type of machine. So it can actually be used either specifically through Linux-based machines, or you can use a version of it through Windows-based machines. So you would just do curl, and then you give it the specific host that you're trying to get access to, and in this particular case this would be the IP address / location, right? So you remember that this was available through, I want to say this is the one for AWS, right? Yeah, so this is AWS IAM. So this is the path, the general path for everything, and then on there you go to IAM security credentials, and then from here you're going to try to steal this specific header. My apologies, it's not a host. We're trying to steal this specific header, assuming that it's available, right? So if there are actual access keys temporarily for those IAM roles, we're going to try to steal them by just doing a simple curl command where it downloads information about a web page, right? So a curl command will just pull information from a web page, and in this particular case we are most interested in this specific header that is the EC2, which is the instance for AWS. This is where instances are managed, so it will be this metadata token, and then whatever the token would be, we're going to try to download and steal or export or exfiltrate, whatever you want to call it. Another one would be to exploit the SSRF on a web application with metadata exposure. Now in this case, it's the actual target domain name, and then if they have load URL, right? So if this piece right here is inside of their URL as a parameter, then we can try to feed our own URL into it to try to pull metadata from that specific company's domain, right? So this is actually a legit type of query that's done via websites that they want to load something from another server that they may have, or they want to pull it from another URL. And so if this has been configured without a specific whitelist or without sanitization, or if they don't have a deny list, whatever, if they just allow anything to be input into this URL parameter, then we can potentially go ahead and put our own location that we're trying to pull from, which in this case again is trying to access the metadata service credentials from this, I believe this is also AWS, so we're trying to pull this also from AWS, right? So if we know that this target is housed on AWS. If their website is being hosted on AWS, we can try to access their data for this specific endpoint to see if we can get their metadata services, the metadata service details. So the mitigations against these types of attacks would be to enable instance metadata service v2, also known as IMDS v2, on AWS to require session tokens. For each session that's trying to access a certain type of data, there should be a new session token that's generated. Therefore, if you enable this, then what will happen is that every time somebody tries to access metadata, it'll ask them for a session token, right? Or it will check for a session token. And if it doesn't exist, then they can't access that data. And those tokens will, of course, be only assigned to individual users that should have access to this type of data. For example, the admins or the domain admin, etc. Then we have restricting the egress traffic to prevent SSRF-based exfiltration. Egress is outgoing, right? So if we are restricting outgoing traffic, it will prevent exfiltration. Exfiltration is when data leaves, right? So if we're restricting that type of traffic, then we're preventing any kind of server-side request forgery exfiltration that may potentially be taking place. And finally, we have web application firewalls, WAFs, to block unauthorized requests, which is the most basic, and it feels like this should exist all the time at every single company's website or their web application, where it just blocks unauthorized requests from unknown IP addresses, and it only has a certain list of IP addresses that are allowed to do certain types of requests, and then every other IP that's not on that list, or every other domain name that's not on that list, is immediately blocked, and they can't do anything. They can't make any kind of request. So if you stack this with this with this, then you have a pretty solid security infrastructure or security posture against these types of attacks that we've been talking about so far. The next one is going to be the IAM misconfiguration and exploitation. So what is IAM? Identity and Access Management. So the name kind of gives all of it away. So identity is the credential, right? So the credentials of users within a company, it's their identity. This is how we authenticate someone, okay? So identity is another way of thinking about authentication. So who is the person and how do we authenticate their identity within our company, okay? That's the first part. The next one is access. So this person, this identity, what do they have access to? And this falls under authorization. So you have authentication, that's identity, and then access is authorization. So what is this person authorized to access? That's essentially what identity and access management is. So IAM controls access to cloud services by managing permissions, roles, and policies. So the person, that identity, what is their role? Based on their role, what permissions do they have and what can they access, right? And what are the policies that essentially manage those things? What are the policies that govern this person's access to these various cloud services? So what we try to do as an attacker is target weak IAM configurations to escalate our privileges and move laterally. Now, privilege escalation doesn't necessarily mean lateral movement or vice versa, right? So lateral movement, I should say. Lateral movement, if you can think about going side by side, side to side, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are escalating your privileges. You can move laterally without getting higher privileges. But what can happen is that based on the next user that you are accessing and based on the next user that you're exploiting, they may have some kind of configuration in their user profile that allows you to escalate your privileges, right? So two people in the same role in the same company should have permissions to do the same things, but one of them could have a weak password, or they could have access to something that they shouldn't have had access to, or somebody gave them access to something and they didn't remove that access. So a variety of different reasons could exist why one person or two people in the same role could have access to different things, And if that's the case, you are now exploiting that access to escalate your privileges and then eventually move up and get some kind of new user that is, an admin or a manager or a supervisor, and then just repeat the process until you get to the position that you're looking for to be able to steal sensitive data or encrypt everything in the network and ask for money. There's a variety of possibilities that could exist, but the overall concept is you're taking advantage of weak IAM configurations, and a part of that IAM configuration, it could be somebody's password, right? It could be that a user has a weak password, and that's how they authenticate themselves, but it's a weak form of authentication. Therefore, you are now able to access that user. Another reason could be that there was no multi-factor authentication set up for that specific user, and MFA was not enforced across every user in the company. Therefore, the people that were just lazy, right, for convenience, they don't want to get access to MFA or they don't want to set up MFA, so they don't. And now you can exploit that user because they have a weak password and they don't have multi-factor authentication. And now you are able to log in as that person and do whatever it is that you want to do. So some of the common misconfigurations in IAM and the attacks that are relative to them could potentially be exploiting overly permissive IAM policies. So a misconfigured role and how that person has permission, right? The permissions that are assigned to that role or to that group of people. So it could be like bank tellers. I always use the bank because the hierarchy inside of a bank is very easy to understand. You have the teller, then you have the immediate supervisor of the teller, you have bankers, and then you have the service manager, also known as the operations manager, and then you have the branch manager, and then there's the district manager, the regional manager, so on, right? So it's just very easy to understand that hierarchy. So when we go look at tellers, they are technically the least privileged roles. That group of people have the least, or they should have the least privileges. So therefore, if something with that group has been misconfigured and now those roles have privilege escalation for whatever pathway or for whatever reason this is something that's possible, or unauthorized access to things that they should not have access to, but the person who administered those users didn't remove the access to certain things, or maybe they gave them temporary access to do a certain job and then they forgot to remove that access, right? That happens all the time. So if any of these things happen, then that's considered a misconfiguration, and now we can exploit the overly permissive environment for that user that has unauthorized access, or we can do privilege escalation, and now we're just taking advantage of something that was just improperly set up. They didn't do it right? So we are going to first try to list the permissions for that current user. So if we know that they are housed on AWS, and one of the easiest ways to do it is to use something like I can't believe that I forgot the name of it, but it's an extension, Wapalizer. The extension that you can literally install to your browser, and from there you can just see what hosting is being used for a given website, and then you know that it's AWS. So if you know that it's AWS, you're just going to do AWS IAM and then list the attached users policies, and then you give them the username, which would be, in this case, the attacker is potentially the username. Now, this implies that you actually have access to this infrastructure somehow. So you're actually hacked this user, right? The excessive permissions that can be exploited for that specific user, it would require that you're already logged in as that user. So this is assuming that you've established that first layer of attacking that has taken place to get into that user's profile, and now you're launching a terminal command line and you're going to say, okay, AWS, list my attached user policies for my user, or a given user, right? So it could be that you're inside of the network somehow, and now you want to know what another user's permissions are, and then you're just going to try to see if you can actually get access to those permissions. Now, once you have figured out what the specific user's permissions are, and let's say you want to now escalate your permissions for that user, you would again do AWS IAM, and you want to attach a user policy to this user, and you're going to do the policy ARN option, and ARN stands for the Amazon resource name. So it's just a unique identifier for resources within Amazon or within AWS. And so you are now going to attach to this user the policy that is for, Amazon Resource Name, AWS IAM, and then the policy is the administrator access. So to this user, we want to attach this administrator access policy, right? Which would then give this user administrator access, right? You are now escalating the privileges of that user by actually just attaching a policy resource name. So this assigns admin privileges to that attacker's IAM account. The mitigations against this, they're very simple, honestly. Follow the principle of least privilege. This is a very basic security principle. We talked about this in Security Plus, in the CompTIA Security Plus training series. And the principle of least privilege basically means you only have the permissions that you need to do your job. That's it, nothing more. And if anything, we will try to remove any possible ancillary resource from you and service from you, literally leaving you with the permissions and the tools, the resources that you need access to do your job. Anything above that, you don't need access to. Very basic, very simple, but extremely effective. Once you have that, you can then implement CloudTrail logging for IAM activity monitoring. So it's basically logging that's available through Amazon AWS or really any kind of cloud service provider. It's just they may have different names for it. And what that does is that it just starts monitoring activity for IAM type commands. So it's like if anybody ever runs AWS IAM, it starts logging it immediately. And if it's a user account that shouldn't be running that, so if it's like a bank teller that's trying to do AWS IAM, immediately you're notified. It's like, why is this teller trying to do IAM? Like, what the hell is, it has nothing to do with their job. What are they doing? So anything that happens with this specific protocol, it immediately gets logged. And for the most part, if it's not on the allowed list of users that can do it, there's an alert that's generated that notifies the security team. And then you would use multi-factor authentication for IAM users to prevent session hijack. Again, super basic, but extremely powerful. Enforce MFA. Don't leave it up to the users to set up MFA, because most people will just deny that setup because it's convenient, right? It's less convenient if they have MFA and now they got to go get a one-time password, whatever. But it's a really high level of security if there is MFA. So if we can do that and actually enforce the users to set up MFA, then it's not up to them. It's not a choice that they can make. They have to set it up, and therefore it increases the security posture of the company and of the cloud environment. The next tactic would be to abuse misconfigured IAM keys. So exploiting the exposed IAM keys. So attackers can search for leaked AWS access keys in GitHub repositories, for example. So you can use a tool like TruffleHog, and then you can look for a regular expression pattern. Make sure that entropy is true, meaning that it can be actually randomized. And then you're looking for JSON format, and then you're looking for this specific repository. So the example would be, let's say, the company name. So if you know that the company has a GitHub repository, you can look through their company name, through the profile of their company name, and see through their repositories if anything exists for an AWS key that you could potentially steal. And another way to do this would literally to use Google hacking, where you just use a few very basic Google advanced search filters, and from there you go ahead and try to search through GitHub's site for keys for a given company. It's really, really basic to do. It's not hard to do. We've talked about it in a lot of different videos. So if you don't know how to do that, I would highly recommend you search through the channel for Google hacking. And even at the very beginning of the CompTIA PenTest Plus training series, so inside of this very playlist that you're watching right now, there are videos towards the beginning for reconnaissance and open source intelligence where we actually talk about Google hacking and Google dorking, so you can find very great resources to be able to pull that off. But you can find AWS keys using TruffleHog or Google dorking and find those leaked GitHub repositories. It's like low-hanging fruit. If this actually exists, it's something that is very, very easily usable. But if the company has any sense, or if the security team has any sense, they wouldn't leave leaked keys inside of their GitHub repository because it's publicly accessible. So it is low-hanging fruit, and if you find it, it's very lucky, but it might not be the case. The thing is, though, like, you always want to go for all the low-hanging fruit first anyways, just in case it exists, because if it does exist, it makes your job extremely easy as an attacker. But if it doesn't exist, then you can move on to more advanced tactics. Another way that you can do this is by using the AWS STS, which is their security token service. And this is one of the features that enables the request of temporary or limited privilege security credentials for users and applications to access AWS resources. So you would use the security token service and get a identity for whatever the access key or secret key that would be available. So it confirms if the stolen AWS keys are actually valid. So the stuff that you just found through GitHub repo, you want to see if those things are actually valid. So you would give the access key as well as the secret key, just in case they have not been deleted or disabled yet, right? So before you go through the rest of your attack, you want to make sure that it actually is usable, the stuff that you found on GitHub. So you would use the STS to get the access or the validity of the access key and the secret key. So the mitigations against this would be to use temporary credentials instead of hard-coded IAM keys. This is actually a very, very big deal, right? So IAM keys specifically are things that they don't need to be hard-coded. And it can be something that's just generated whenever the use case arises. The credentials for the user could be, credentials that are permanent until that person is fired or they quit. That's fine. But the credentials for those keys, those specific keys, can be temporary. And you can rotate those keys and make sure that those things haven't been leaked. And monitoring for the leaks is as simple as creating a script that goes and does a Google query and searches to see if the key is now in the public eye, right? If it's available to the public. And then if it is, then you can go ahead and disable it or delete it and then recreate a new one. So you would rotate the keys regularly and monitor them for leaks. So the regular rotation could be, let's say, every month. But if you're monitoring for leaks, you notice that it just got leaked 4 days ago. And so you immediately go ahead and change that out. And it goes into immediate rotation instead of waiting for the end of the month to automatically do it, right? Then you have the implementation of the secret manager. The secrets manager is another resource that's available through AWS, and it stores things securely. So a secret in this particular case would be the key. So these access keys and these secret keys are technically secrets. And so if you want to keep your secrets secret, you would implement the secrets manager, and it stores those keys in an encrypted location that cannot be accessed by the public, and it can only be accessed either by the user, by that specific identity, or it would be managed by the administrator of the cloud for that company. Our next tactic will be the container escape and Kubernetes exploitation. So containers and Kubernetes are usually used in the same breath. And containers can be launched via the Docker or Kubernetes. So a container is basically, think about it as a container that has software and all of the requirements for the software to operate. So everything is inside of that container, and if somebody needs to launch it, they can launch it directly from the container instead of having to download all the requirements and the software and install it and go through that entire motion. They could just launch it directly from the container. But what happens is that they can sometimes be escaped. So if you're using the software inside of a container, you are inside of that container. A container escape means when you're supposed to be isolated, but you somehow found a way out of that container. Now, when you leave the container, you're in the warehouse at large. Let's just kind of use that as a visual example. So imagine that you got access to a container, you're inside of the container, you're doing whatever you need to do in there, but that container is inside of a warehouse with a bunch of other containers and other systems and machines and things like that. And you should only get access to that one container that you're in. You shouldn't be able to get out of it and roam around the warehouse and do everything else that you need to do. So when you can escape that container because of some kind of a misconfiguration, now you are free to roam around in the warehouse and access another container or access another machine or go into the office of the warehouse manager or do a bunch of other things that you were never even supposed to have permission to do because you were just supposed to be isolated inside of this one container. So you should be isolated, but there are misconfigurations that allow you to break out of the container and gain access of the host machine or the network at large inside of the cloud, etc. So common container techniques or escape techniques would be privileged container. So you run access to that container with root permissions, right? That's a misconfiguration. You shouldn't have access to that container as a root user, but you were able to just run it as a root or run it with admin privileges, and now you're able to access it as an admin or a root user, and then from there you can launch specific commands to get out of that container, right? Get out of that isolated environment. The mounting of a host file system, so the host that's actually running it or the host that that container is installed upon, running on top of, if you get access to the etc password file inside of that host, right? Or getting access to the root.ssh, which is the SSH key typically that is installed or pre-configured on that user. So now you can get remote host by just using that SSH key instead of even getting the password or having to decode or decrypt the password. You just use an SSH key and then you log in as a root user via secure shell, and now you have a remote connection to that host that is at a root privilege. And then exploiting the misconfiguration capabilities. So the misconfigured capabilities, for example, using a function like cap SysAdmin to execute privileged commands, which is essentially another way of saying that you can run a container with root privileges. This should be disabled. This should not be something that anybody can run. That function is not available to all users, or it should not be available to all users. But if it hasn't been turned off, then you can actually run it if you know about something like this, right? So you would need to know about what that function is that can actually make you run things as privileged commands. But once you know that it exists, which here you go, now you know that it exists. So once you know that it exists, you can then execute commands as a privileged user. Our next tactic would be to exploit the weaknesses of a container. So exploiting a privileged container. So if the container itself runs as root, right? So you don't have to run it as root. The container itself has been configured to run as a root or with root permissions. Then you can escape and access the host machine. You can get out of that container and access the host machine. So we can check for the privileged mode in Docker by doing a docker inspect command. And then we're looking for the privileged configurations of the host, and then we give it the ID of the container that we're in. And if the response is true, the container will run with full system privileges. So if this actually yields a true response, then you will now be able to run that container with full system privileges, meaning running it essentially as the host. And then you would follow up with a docker run command, and then you would be able to run as a privileged user. You would be running Ubuntu bash, which is basically the terminal, the command line for Linux machines. And then you would give yourself root, and then you would give access to the actual bin bash location. This is the path that typically houses the bash, the terminal. Bash is, I guess, the language that the terminal inside of Linux is based on, the syntax of it. Bash could be it could be ZSH. There's a few different versions of the shell, but this is a shell, essentially. It's the path to the shell. So you are giving yourself access. You're executing commands on the host system via this command right here. So if this is successful, you are now able to run bash, run a shell on the host system as a root, right? As a root user. The root file system is where you're trying to mount, right here. You can see this. You're mounting the root file system, and then you're there running a shell from that root file system. So the mitigations against container escapes would be to run all containers as non-root users. That's just a default configuration that should be, right? No container should be run as a root user. Everything should be run in non-root. Then you would disable privileged mode in container configuration so that if somebody wanted to run that container as a root user, they would not be able to. And then you use something like seccomp and AppArmor profiles for runtime restrictions. So as somebody is using that container, there are restrictions placed on them during their runtime that they can't run certain commands or they can't do certain things that would allow them to escape, or they would allow them to exploit the configurations of the container. Now we can move on to Kubernetes, and Kubernetes has something called a cluster. So if we wanted to exploit those clusters, we can potentially search to see if the API of that Kubernetes server is publicly accessible. If it is publicly accessible, then we can hijack that cluster and the resources within it. So we can check for the open API server of Kubernetes by just doing kubectl get pods and then get all of the namespaces. And if there's no authentication that's required, that means that this specific cluster is actually exposed, or a given cluster is exposed, right? So very simple command to check to see if the API server that the Kubernetes cluster is running on is publicly accessible. You can also just grant escalated privileges to a given user by taking advantage of the role-based access control. So misconfigurations in role-based access control can potentially lead to you getting admin privileges. So for example, kubectl again, you're now creating a cluster role binding. So you're basically binding a role cluster, right? So how should I say this? You're binding the role to a cluster. That's better. So you're binding a role to a cluster. This is the role. The cluster permissions is the admin that we have right here, and the user itself is the attacker. So if you launch this and the misconfiguration exists, you are now granting admin privileges to the attacker user that we have right here. So the mitigations against this kind of an exploit would be to restrict public access to Kubernetes API servers. Very basic, right? So these are things that, again, like the overall, like the entire thing is based on somebody misconfiguring this, somebody setting it up incorrectly, and now there's public access available to something that should have been private all along. So you want to restrict public access to these types of servers. Now that you've done that, you want to then go ahead and implement role-based access control with the concept of least privilege, the principle of least privilege. So whatever the role is that's accessing these types of servers, they should have the least privilege. They should not be able to get to run commands that only belong to admins. For example, this is a command that should only belong to an admin. No other user should be able to assign a role or bind a role to a given cluster and then give them the cluster admin permissions. No user other than the admin should be able to do something like this, right? So implementing RBAC, role-based access controls with least privilege, and then enabling network policies to control the communication between pods. So from one pod to another pod, they should not have the ability to freely communicate and send any kind of commands or communications back and forth. There should only be limited communications allowed to do the things that have the least privilege, or whatever is required for those roles, for those pods, right? So there is a handful of things that are required for those pods to communicate with each other to achieve the end result for a given user. So we're going to enable the types of policies that would limit the communication between those pods. That's basically it, right? You want to control the communication between those pods, which is really another way of saying role-based access control, right? You want to make sure that these pods can only communicate based on the permissions of a given role, the authorizations, the access of a given role. So let's go through some of these tools. So we have PackU, we have KubeHunter, Scout Suite, and Cloud Exploit. So PackU is an AWS exploitation framework used for privilege escalation, IAM attacks. KubeHunter scans Kubernetes clusters for misconfigurations. Scout Suite is a security auditing tool for clouds, so AWS, Google Cloud, or Azure. And CloudSploit detects cloud misconfigurations automatically and allows you to exploit them. So let's go look at some of the details for these guys. Starting out with PACU, so it automates, again, AWS security assessments and privilege escalation. It automates this entire process for you. So if you want to enumerate IAM roles with PACU, you literally just do run and then IAM enum roles. So this is assuming that you're already inside of PACU. You've already instantiated it, you've launched it, and now you just want to say run, and then you give it the module name. So IAM enumerate roles, and then it'll list all of the IAM roles and their permissions. So very basic, like really simple to do, but again, just very powerful. These tools are invaluable. When you learn about them and when you learn how to use them, they are invaluable. Moving on to KubeHunter, which finds security flaws in a Kubernetes cluster. So you run it, first you start it, or you access it essentially via your command line. So you would do kube-hunter and then remote is what you're trying to do, a remote target. And then you would try to find the target's cluster IP. So it detects misconfigured role-based access control or open Kubernetes dashboards and API leaks for a given Kubernetes cluster that's available. So that's, again, very, very simple, right? So the target cluster IP is the piece right here that you need to replace with the IP address of the target cluster. So that you're not going to do remote and then just type this in. You're doing remote and then giving it the IP address of the target cluster, and then it's going to try to detect misconfigured role-based access control or dashboards that are open or any kind of APIs that have been leaked. Scout Suite is even simpler. So it basically performs an assessment against a given cloud to see what kind of misconfigurations exist. So scanning an AWS environment is as simple as saying scout AWS, which identifies insecure IAM roles, open S3 buckets, or weak security policies. I would say that there's a piece of this that's missing. That would be the actual IP address of that AWS environment, unless you're running this from within the AWS environment. But there needs to be some kind of a target host that's provided. So this piece is missing. This specific command feels like it's missing something, because if you just do scout AWS, it's probably just going to run every specific, like literally every available AWS bucket or what, which is going to be millions. There's like million instances on AWS because so many companies use AWS. So I really believe that there's something missing here. So scout AWS and whatever the target would be should be the complete command to be able to pull the information about an AWS environment. And that brings us to our practice questions for section 4.6 for cloud attacks. So the question formats for this, just like everything else, are aligned with the PenTest Plus examination. That does not mean that they are duplicates of what you'll find in the PenTest Plus exams. That's forbidden. It's illegal. We sign NDAs. When we go take any CompTIA examination, we are forbidden, and it's very explicit. They tell you that you can't do this. If you do, it's you're breaking multiple laws. We can take you to court, all that stuff. So we can't give you the exact questions, but what we can do is we can introduce you to the formats and get you close to the question types and teach you how to think and how to find the answers by using your critical thinking abilities. And that's basically my goal, because first of all, there are too many questions for you to try to memorize. That would be one thing, and it's all randomized, so you may memorize a set of questions and you will never be exposed to them because the questions have been randomized or they've been recreated when you actually go take your exam. So it's better for you to actually understand the content and learn how to think. That's number one. The second part is it's impossible. It's impossible to try to word for word memorize every question and answer. I don't know, some people do that. I've never been good at that. I have never been good at memorizing each question and be like, okay, this is the answer options and this is what the correct answer is. It just doesn't work. So if you learn how to think, and if you learn how to use deductive reasoning, and if you learn how to look for the obvious answers and all that stuff, you should be good. And that's like a big hint that I'll give you, is that if you have to convince yourself of what the answer is, like be like, oh, this could be the answer, and then you're trying to argue with yourself and convince yourself, that's probably not the answer. But if you find the most obvious choice, I would say that's the answer. And then you'll see what we're going through. Like as we go through these questions, you'll see that there are going to be some that, okay, they're, I could see that could be potentially an answer. And then some of them are just going to pop out as the right answer. And that's the answer always. It's always the obvious answer. It's not the one that you have to convince yourself of. So just keep that in mind. So there are going to be 3 types of questions. You have the multiple choice questions that require one answer from you. You have the multiple response questions that will require 2 or more answers. And then there are performance-based questions. So for example, they give you a scenario and then you have to figure out what the answer would be, or they will give you the result of a command, and then you have to try to figure out what the command was that was executed, or what the tool was that they used to get that result. Or they'll give you a command, or they'll give you a tool screenshot, and they'll say, okay, what's the result of this? And then you have to find it out the other way. There might be mix and match questions where you have to match responses to given options, things like that. So in the slideshow that we have, we're going to have these 2, and then we're going to also have scenario-based questions. And then, of course, you can get access to this entire notes document. In the rest of this notes document, there's mix and match questions and a bunch of other types of performance-based questions as well. And then the slideshow as well, you can get access to that. And you can get access to all of those things by joining Hackaholics Anonymous as an agent level member or above. And you have already been notified of that at the beginning of this video, and then there's going to be another notification at the end of it. And then there's instructions on how to join Hackaholics Anonymous in the description below this video. So that being said, let's jump into the practice questions for section 4.6. Okay, here we go. So what is the goal of a metadata service attack in a cloud environment? To encrypt virtual machines for ransom? No, that's ransomware. To retrieve sensitive instance data such as access tokens or IAM credentials? That's close. I think that's probably the most obvious. To brute force the cloud admin portal? Not necessarily, no. To scan container images for malware? That is also, this sounds like a defensive security thing that they have to do. So they're scanning the container images for malware to try to solve it or to patch it. So that seems like something for the blue team to do. So the most obvious to me is B, and that is the answer. Okay, great. Which of the following are common methods for performing metadata service attacks? And we need to select 2. So server-side request forgery that redirect requests to this specific IP, which was the IP for Azure and for AWS. So I'm going to say yes. Exploiting open reverse proxies within the environment. That sounds fancy, but I don't know if that's what we would do. Running IP tables -F in the cloud router, and IP tables is kind of like a firewall that exists, so I don't think that this would be the case either. And using DNS poisoning to hijack web traffic, this is not it either. So we're doing performing of metadata service attacks. So it's not this. So if in this case, if I'm not sure of the answer, I would delete or remove all of the answers that I know are not true. So it's not C and it's not D. So it has to be A and B. Yeah, okay. Exploiting open reverse proxies within the environment. Open reverse proxies within the environment. That's interesting. Okay. All right. Which of the following is a common consequence of overly permissive IAM policies in the cloud environment? So basically what happens if the permissions are too open? So disabling VM instances, maybe, right? That's something that somebody could probably do, but I don't know why they would do that, because that would alert the team and therefore you would catch on to the hacker. Privilege escalation by exploiting role chaining or excessive permissions. That could be a thing. So you could actually escalate your privileges by going from role to role to role by creating a chain essentially, and then finding permissions. So that could be it. Launching too many containers. I don't understand why that would be a bad thing. It could be like a denial of service maybe, or you could run up the bill or like the invoice that they would have to pay for. That could be a thing. Failover redundancy failure. that is not something that would be around. I mean, again, we could do this, right? So I can convince myself that these could be the answers, but it's something that the most obvious would be B in this case. Yeah. Okay, which IAM misconfigurations are commonly exploited by attackers? And we need to select 3 here. So the misconfigurations of IAM: assigning admin rights to service accounts. Sure, yeah. Using wildcard actions like S3 or IAM, and then the asterisk, which would then give a placeholder of anything and everything. That's what the wildcard character of the asterisk does. Failing to use multi-factor authentication that's definitely yes. That's a yes right there. Setting default web application firewall rules. This is not an IAM misconfiguration. It is a misconfiguration, but it's not an IAM misconfiguration. Scanning the metadata API for DNS servers, that is also not an IAM misconfiguration. So A and C are for sure, but B, I think, is the other one. Yeah. What is a container escape? So remember the warehouse example, right? You're inside of a container, you use some kind of misconfiguration to get out of it, and now you can go inside of the host or inside of the warehouse and get access to a bunch of other things. So it's when a container processes terminates unexpectedly. No, when an attacker breaks out of a container and gains access to the host. Yep, that's the answer. I'm just going to say that because that's the most obvious answer. Which condition can make Kubernetes clusters vulnerable to exploitation? So Kubernetes clusters being vulnerable to exploitation. What are the conditions? So exposed Kubernetes dashboard without authentication. That's 100% yes. Containers running with root privileges and mounted volumes. That's also a yes. That's a misconfiguration. Use of VPN concentrators. No. Local backups of firewall configurations. No, these 2 are completely irrelevant. So it would have to be A and B. Yeah. Which tool is designed specifically for AWS penetration testing and simulating attacks on IAM configuration? So this is kind of where we have to go. Okay, so I know what isn't the tool. So WP scan is for WordPress websites for web application attacks. GoBuster is enumeration of websites. They also referred to it previously as brute forcing directories or trying to find basically hidden directories or hidden files or hidden subdomains. So that's what GoBuster does, is enumeration. Zap is a vulnerability scanner for websites. So all 3 of these are wrong. So PACU would be the only one that would be the right answer, and we did talk about it, so that has to be it. Which tools are effective for auditing or attacking cloud Kubernetes environments? So 3 tools here. So KubeHunter, yes. So we're talking about cloud or Kubernetes. So KubeHunter, yes. Scout Suite, yes. Mimikatz is a password dumper. It helps you dump password hashes and credentials. Hydra is for brute forcing login forms on websites and cracking passwords and things like that. So it's definitely not D or E. So it has to be KubeHunter, Scout Suite, and PACU. And there we go. So here's a scenario. You launch an SSRF attack against a cloud-hosted web app and receive access credentials from this location. So this is what we've done with the metadata attack, right? So this is a metadata attack. What vulnerability and resource were targeted? So SSRF targeting the cloud metadata service. I think that's pretty much it. SQLI would be SQL injection targeting IAM tokens, which could exist, right? SQL is the database language, so you're pulling information from databases if you do a correct injection attack. And then you could potentially pull IAM tokens if they're inside of that database. RFI, remote file inclusion, targeting container logs. That's not it, because we're not getting container logs here. We're trying to get credentials, right? And I just know that this is where we have the metadata that's stored for Azure, and this actually happens to be AWS's path. So multi-factor bypass via session replay, definitely not D, and it's not C or B. It has to be A. So there it is. You run Scout Suite against Google Cloud and discover that service accounts have broad editor permissions and storage buckets are publicly accessible. What kind of misconfiguration is this? So is it over permissioning IAM and data exposure? DNS enumeration error, that's not it. SSL certificate sprawl is not it. Role-based access control abuse in Kubernetes is not it. This is actually, so this is, role-based access control can apply to editor permissions and storage buckets and things like that, but there's no reference here at all about Kubernetes. So this can be an answer, but I think the most obvious answer is A, the IAM over permissioning and data exposure. And that is the answer. Excellent. So while auditing a Kubernetes cluster, you discover that the API server accepts unauthenticated requests and that etcd, so etcd, is accessible on the public internet. Okay, so while auditing a Kubernetes cluster, you discover that the API server accepts unauthenticated requests and that etcd is accessible on the public internet. So which two vulnerabilities are present? Insecure API access, so yeah, I'll say that's because the API server accepts unauthenticated requests, so yes. Public exposure of sensitive cluster data, I mean, that's also yes. MFA replay attack is not it. Wi-Fi deauthentication is not it. These are completely irrelevant. So it definitely has to be A and B. There you go. All right, so you gain access to a containerized app that mounts the host's var docker.sock. So you use it to spin up a new privileged container and break out to the host. Which technique are you demonstrating? So you gain access to a containerized app that mounts the host's partition. So this is basically a partition. And you use it to spin up a new privileged container and break out of the host. So we're breaking out of the container, right? So container escape, essentially. So which technique are you demonstrating? Container escape via Docker socket abuse. Okay, yes. Kerberos, ticket granting, ticket injection. This is not it. Local file inclusion exploitation is not it. And DNS spoofing is not it. We are escaping a container, right? So you spin up a new privileged container and break out to the host. We are escaping a container via Docker abuse. Yes. All right, and that's it. So that was it for our cloud attacks. And in the next video, we're going to be talking about wireless attacks. So if you have any questions about what we talked about today, please drop it in the comment section below. Or if you have any comments and things that you need clarified, drop it in the comment section below. If you want to get access to the notes document that I use for the lecture, as well as this slideshow that we use for the practice questions, make sure that you stay tuned for the final message about Hackaholics Anonymous so that you can get access to those documents for yourself. And of course, as always, make sure that you like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so that you get notified the next time that a video comes out. And the videos for PenTest Plus come out every Friday. So if you're watching with me as I create these and upload them weekly, then the next one is going to come out next Friday. If you're seeing this in the future, most likely all of these are already done, and you can find the entire series in the CompTIA PenTest Plus playlist that's available on this channel. But in either case, make sure that you like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so that you get notified the next time that any content comes out on this channel. I hope that you found value from this. If no one else loves you, Hank loves you. Love, peace, and chicken grease. And I will see you in next week's episode. To get the PenTest Plus notes, practice questions, and to join a supportive community of like-minded people like you, consider joining the Hackaholics Anonymous membership community. We have 4 tiers: the supporter, the agent, the guardian, and the master. And each tier gets their own Discord server and early access to content. The agent, guardian, and master levels will get exclusive content like line-by-line code explanations for how to create cybersecurity and PenTest Plus scripts, like exclusive downloads that they will get. For example, the notes document for this PenTest Plus and everything that I'm using for the lectures, as well as all of the practice questions and everything else that will go along that will be made for the scripts and everything else that we're going to be doing for the PenTest Plus training series. There will be free pre-made monthly Python automations that have to do with system administration, cybersecurity defense, as well as, of course, PenTest Plus and ethical hacking. And then there's going to be monthly live streams with me every single month, plus so many other things that you would get as a part of being a member of Hackaholics Anonymous in these tiers. To join, you can simply click the link in the description below, Or you can go to our homepage and click the join button there. Or you can go to youtube.com/@hankhackshackers/join, and you'll be able to join Hackaholics Anonymous.